In a gallery of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York hangs a painting of a city under a torn green sky. The hill is crowded with towers. The light is coming from nowhere and everywhere. It was painted more than 400 years ago by a Greek who had made his home in Spain, and it may be the most haunting portrait any artist has ever made of a place. The city is Toledo. Americans have been standing in front of that canvas for a century, and most of them leave without knowing the two things about Toledo that matter most: that its name once meant the finest steel in Europe, a byword for a perfect blade, carried by soldiers and repeated by playwrights and eventually borrowed by Hollywood, and that historians remember it for something stranger. A few remarkable generations when Christians, Muslims and Jews work side by side on the same manuscripts, translating the lost knowledge of the ancient world, and helped hand Europe back its own memory. The sword and the book, on the same grey rock, in the same narrow streets. How both stories can be true is what this film exists to answer. It begins with a river that refused to run straight. Chapter 1. The Rock Above the River. Before there was a city, there was a bend in a river. Find the River Tagus on a map of Spain, the longest river in the Iberian Peninsula, running west across the high central plateau toward the Atlantic. For most of its journey, it moves through open country, but at one point, almost exactly in the middle of the peninsula, it meets a resistant mass of granite and gneiss, and over immense stretches of time, the water has carved a tight horseshoe loop around it, cutting a gorge with walls of bare stone dropping to the current below. The rock won. The river went around. Stand on the hill inside that loop and turn in a circle. To the south, the east, and the west. The ground falls away beneath your feet, and the river is a moat that nature spent millions of years digging. Only the northern side connects to open land, and that single approach can be watched and walled by a modest number of defenders. Military engineers have a phrase for ground like this. They call it a natural fortress. The people of ancient Iberia needed no phrase. They could see it, and they saw it early. Across the gorge from the old city rises a hill called Cerro del Bu, where archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a settlement dating back to the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. Stone foundations, pottery, the traces of ordinary lives lived on high ground above water. Before Rome was anything more than a village in Italy, people were already living beside this bend in the Tagus, already organized around the logic of the rock. So this chapter is not really about a founding. Nobody founded Toledo the way colonists founded a city like Boston, arriving with a charter and a plan. Toledo was recognized rather than founded. Generation after generation looked at the hill in the loop of the river and reached the same conclusion. Whoever holds this place is very hard to remove. Who was holding it when written history arrives? The Romans, our first written source for the region, called the people of this part of the plateau the Carpetani. They were one of the pre-Roman peoples of central Iberia, living where several cultural worlds overlapped and traded, and honesty requires admitting how much we do not know about them. They left no books. What we have is what archaeology recovers and what their conquerors wrote. And history written by the conqueror always needs careful handling. The material evidence sketches a consistent picture. Farmers and herders on the river plains, communities organized enough to build fortified settlements on the heights, warriors when they had to be, in a peninsula where raiding was part of the rhythm of life. One more thing about their world matters for everything that follows, and it lies under the ground. The Iberian Peninsula is rich in metal, copper, silver, and above all, iron, and long before Rome arrived, the smiths of Iberia had earned a reputation across the ancient Mediterranean for edged weapons of unusual quality. Ancient writers describe Iberian blades with a mixture of admiration and alarm. This matters to our story, but let us be precise about how it matters, because precision here will save us from a legend later. The reputation belonged to Iberian smithing as a broad craft tradition, spread across many communities of the peninsula. No source lets us point at the rock above the Tagus and say the famous blades were made exactly here. What we can say is that the people of this region belonged to a culture that took iron seriously, and that a reputation was being born in these centuries which one city, much later, would claim, defend, and carry further than anyone in the Iron Age could have imagined. Now, a word about geography and character, because this series makes an argument and you deserve to see it stated plainly. Most great cities exist because of movement. Paris controlled a river crossing. Boston controlled a harbour. They were built to let the world pass through, and they grew rich on everything that passed. The logic of this place points the other way. A hill wrapped in a gorge is not a marketplace. It is a stronghold, a place you hold. Geography does not determine politics, and no landscape can force people to behave one way for 2,000 years. But geography deals the cards, and the cards dealt here favoured defence, endurance, and a certain stubbornness about outsiders. Watch how often the people of this rock, under every flag and every faith to come, choose to shut the gates and dare the world to come up the hill. It happens enough times that you will start to wonder whether the rock chose its people as much as the people chose the rock. At the close of the 3rd century before the birth of Christ, then, picture the place. A grey hill in a loop of green water, a fortified community on the heights, one of many belonging to the Carpetani, iron in the hills of the wider country, and smiths who knew their business. A small, tough world at the centre of a peninsula the great powers of the Mediterranean had mostly ignored. That neglect was ending, far to the south and east. 2 superpowers, Rome and Carthage, were fighting for the ancient world, and Spain, with its silver and its soldiers, was one of the prizes. When Rome won, its legions stayed, and year by year they pushed inland from the coasts toward the plateau, toward the river, toward the rock. The soldiers marching up those roads carried short swords of a design their fathers had copied from Iberian enemies. They were about to meet the country that inspired it. Chapter 2. Toletum. Every empire is also a shopping list. Rome conquered for land and glory, but it kept what worked, wherever it found it. Greek gods, Carthaginian ship design, and from Spain, most famously, a sword. Let us get the story of that sword right, because getting it right matters more to this film than almost any other single fact. By the time Roman legions reached the middle Tagus Valley, the standard sidearm of the Roman infantryman was a short cut and thrust weapon. The Romans themselves called the gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before Christ and describing Roman equipment in detail, tells us the design was adopted from the Iberian Peninsula, and most modern historians place that adoption during the wars against Carthage, when Rome faced Iberian warriors and mercenaries and learned at painful first hand what their blades could do. Notice the timeline. Rome adopted the Spanish sword before Rome ever owned this city, so we cannot claim, and we will not claim, that the legions were armed from workshops on this rock. What Rome carried was the reputation of Iberian steel. stamped into the name of its own favourite weapon, advertised by every legionary who praised his Spanish sword from Britain to Syria. A brand was being built. The city at the centre of our story would one day claim that brand and never let it go. And here is how far that name would eventually travel. If you have driven the interstates of the American Midwest, you have passed signs for Toledo, Ohio, a port city on Lake Erie with a population in the hundreds of thousands. It carries this name because someone in the 1830s chose it in honor of the Spanish city on the Tagus. Why they chose it, nobody can say for certain. Local historians in Ohio have recorded several competing explanations, and the honest answer is that the reason was already being argued about within living memory of the founding. But the fact of the naming stands, and it tells you something remarkable about the reach of a reputation. 9,000 kilometers from the gorge, in a country that would not exist for another 2,000 years, the name of this rock was still worth borrowing. First, though, Rome had to take the rock, and it was not easy. According to the Roman historian Livy, in the 190s before the birth of Christ, the commander Marcus Fulvius Nobilior fought the Carpetani and their allies in hard campaigns along the Tagus, and it is in Livy's account of these wars that our city enters written history under its Roman name, Toletum, with a phrase that has followed it ever since. A small city, he wrote, but fortified by its location. By around 192 before the birth of Christ, Toletum belonged to Rome. 22 centuries later, Livy's 7 words are still the best one-line description of Toledo ever written. What did Rome do with its small fortified prize? For a long time, honestly, not much. Toletum was a useful interior town, while the glamour of Roman Spain lived elsewhere, in the rich cities of the south and the coast. But it grew, and it rose in the ranks of the empire's towns, acquiring the standing of a self-governing community under Roman law and, at some point in this long provincial career, striking coins of its own. And in the 2nd century it built something that still surprises people who find its ruins in a quiet park today. A circus, a stadium for chariot racing, which archaeologists estimate could hold on the order of 10,000 spectators or more, far beyond the population of the town itself. No account survives of a single day inside it, but we know what Roman race days were like across the empire. So imagine one here around the year 180. The stone benches are packed, because this stadium was never built for the town alone. Farm families have walked in from across the valley. Traders have set up under the arches, selling wine and olives and hot food and painted clay souvenirs of the famous drivers. Down on the sand, light chariots wait behind the starting gates, the horses feeling the crowd, the way horses always have. A magistrate drops a white cloth. The gates crash open, and for the next quarter hour, this provincial town on the edge of empire sounds exactly like Rome itself. Thousands of voices rising and falling as one. Wagers shouted across the tiers. Children on their fathers' shoulders screaming for a team whose colours they will defend all year. The empire was not only roads and taxes, it was a shared show, playing in 1,000 towns at once. And on race days, Toletum was as Roman as anywhere on earth. Around that stadium, over 3 centuries, the rest of the Roman package arrived. Water works to bring supply onto the rock across difficult ground. Baths, villas with mosaic floors, found beneath the streets of the modern city. Beneath Toledo, there is always another Toledo. Remember that, because this city will bury and rebuild itself again and again in this story. And along the Roman roads, quietly, came a new faith, Christianity reached Spain early, and by the year 400, the Christian community of Toletum was substantial enough to host a recorded council of bishops. Local tradition also tells of a young woman named Leocadia, said to have died for the faith in the persecutions around the year 300, and she remains the city's patron saint. As always, we keep the layers honest. The council is documented history. The details of Leocadia's life come through later tradition and belong to the literature of the saints, but the direction of travel is solid. The town of the charioteers was becoming a Christian city, and its bishops were becoming men of consequence. They would need to be, because Rome was dying. Through the 400s, the Western Empire came apart, frontier by frontier, and in the chaos, tribal confederations crossed into Spain and carved it up. The people of Toletum survived the way this city would always survive, behind walls, on high ground, while the world below changed owners. Out of the wreckage came a Germanic people with a Roman education, refugees of a lost kingdom in Gaul, looking for a land to rule and a centre to rule it from. They were the Visigoths. Their eyes fell on the rock above the river, and for the first time in its existence, the small city, fortified by its location, was about to become a capital. Chapter 3. Capital of a Forgotten Kingdom. Ask an American audience to name the kingdoms of the early Middle Ages, and you will hear about the Franks, the Saxons, the Vikings. Almost nobody names the Visigoths. Yet for the better part of 2 centuries these people ruled nearly all of Spain from Toledo, and the questions they wrestled with on this rock, how crown and church should share power, who belongs to a nation and who does not, have never stopped mattering. This is the forgotten kingdom. Forgetting it is a mistake. The Visigoths entered history's spotlight in the year 410, when their king Alaric led them through the gates of Rome itself and sacked the Eternal City for 3 days. The shock echoed around the ancient world, but the Visigoths were not simple destroyers. They had lived along Rome's borders for generations, fought in Rome's armies, absorbed Rome's ideas of law and majesty. After the sack, they moved west and built a kingdom centered on Toulouse in southern Gaul. In 507 they lost it, crushed by the rising power of the Franks under Clovis, pushed south over the Pyrenees into Spain. They rebuilt, and by the middle of the 500s their kings had settled the court at Toledo. By now you can read the logic yourself. The rock was defensible. The site sat near the geographic centre of the peninsula, roads radiating outward, so that a king holding Toledo sat in the middle of his realm like a spider in its web. The modest Roman town became the urbs regia, the royal city. Palaces rose, churches rose. The bishops of Toledo began their climb toward primacy over all the churches of Spain, a rank the Archbishop of Toledo still holds today. The king who forged the kingdom was Leovigild, who reigned from 568 to 586, a relentless campaigner who broke rebel provinces and wore the crown in imperial style. But his reign exposed the kingdom's deepest fault line, and it ran through his own family. The Visigothic elite followed Arian Christianity, a version of the faith that understood the divine nature of Christ differently, while the Hispano-Roman majority they ruled was Catholic. 2 peoples, 1 kingdom, 2 churches. Leovigild's son Hermenegild converted to the faith of the majority and rose in rebellion against his father. The revolt failed, and the son died in prison, remembered by later accounts as a martyr, though the earliest sources are more guarded and historians still argue over the whole affair. What no one disputes is what came next. Leovigild's second son, Regerd, inherited the throne and read the situation with cold clarity. A ruling class cannot stand apart from its people forever. In 589, at the Third Council of Toledo, King Ricard formally renounced Arianism and led his nobility into the Catholic faith. On parchment, Spain now had one king, one church, one faith. Reality moved slower than proclamation, and the fusion of the two peoples took generations to work through the countryside. But the direction was set, and the place where it was set matters. One of the foundational alliances between monarchy and church in medieval Iberia was sealed here, in a council chamber in Toledo, with bishops and a king seated together. That chamber became the kingdom's central institution. Again and again through the 600s, kings summoned the great councils of Toledo, where churchmen and nobles legislated on everything from theology to taxation to treason. Do not picture a parliament. Picture a forum in which royal power was repeatedly negotiated with the men who held the church and the land, and where a king who ignored the outcome did so at his peril. Scholars gathered too. The greatest mind of the age, Isidore of Seville, was a bishop of this kingdom, and his Encyclopedia of Ancient Knowledge became one of the most copied books of the entire Middle Ages. Whatever else this kingdom was, it took ideas seriously. And now the darkness, because this series does not look away. The same councils that built the church-state turned it against the one community standing outside it. Jews had lived in Spain since Roman times, perhaps longer. Under the fused crown and church, they became the target of escalating law. Around 616, King Sigebert ordered Jews to convert to Christianity or leave. One of the most sweeping royal campaigns of forced conversion in early medieval Western Europe. Later councils piled on restrictions, seizures of property, the removal of children from families accused of secretly keeping their old faith, and at the 17th Council of Toledo in 694, Jews accused of conspiracy were condemned to enslavement. These laws survive in the Visigothic legal texts. They are not legend, and their meaning for our story is terrible and precise. Centuries before the Inquisition existed, the pattern of state persecution in Spain, suspicion, forced conversion, the hunting of insincere converts, was written down here, in Toledo, by councils of Christian bishops. When this film reaches the fires of 1391, remember where the pattern was first written. Why does a kingdom this organized fall apart? Because of a flaw at the very top. The Visigothic crown was elective, and any powerful noble could dream of wearing it. Kings were deposed and murdered with such regularity that a phrase arose, the disease of the Goths. The killing of kings. Every succession was a potential civil war, and by 710 the kingdom faced exactly that. A king named Roderick held Toledo. The family of the previous king refused to accept him. The realm split into factions that feared each other more than they feared anyone outside. They were watching the wrong direction. Across the narrow strait at the southern tip of the peninsula, a new power had been advancing along the African coast for decades, carrying a faith less than a century old. 2 centuries of law and learning on this rock, and the thing that would end them was already ashore in Africa, 8 miles away, waiting for the summer sailing weather. Chapter 4. One battle, one morning, one new world. Kingdoms usually die slowly. The kingdom of Toledo collapsed in less than a decade, and its capital fell almost without a fight. The story of how is one of the most dramatic in the entire Middle Ages, and one of the hardest to tell honestly, because the sources are few. late, and soaked in legend, so we will do what we have done before. The story first, the evidence second, and a clear line between them. In the spring of 711, a commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait from North Africa with an army of perhaps 7,000 men, most of them Berbers, soldiers of the Umayyad Caliphate, the vast Islamic empire that now stretched from the borders of India to the Atlantic. The mountain where he landed still bears his name. Gibraltar comes from Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. King Roderick marched south with the Visigothic army to meet him, and somewhere in the far south, most likely near the river Guadalete, though even the site is debated, the two armies met that summer. Roderick lost, and Roderick died. The battle did not conquer a kingdom in a day. No battle does. What it did was remove the king and shatter the field army of a state already cracked down the middle, and through those cracks the conquest poured. Later accounts claimed that the factions loyal to the old royal family abandoned Roderick on the battlefield itself. Modern historians agree that political division fatally weakened the kingdom, but the sources are too thin to reconstruct exactly who betrayed whom on the day, and we will not pretend otherwise. The deeper truth needs no embroidery. The kingdom of Toledo was not simply invaded, it was opened, from within, by its own divisions. Now the legend, one of the most famous in Spanish history. Later chronicles tell of a Count Julian, governor of Ceuta on the African shore, whose daughter was violated by King Roderick at the court of Toledo, and who took his revenge by offering the invaders his ships and the keys to Spain. It is a perfect story, too perfect. The earliest account written inside Spain, a Latin text known as the Chronicle of 754, composed by a Christian living under the new rulers just 4 decades later, knows nothing of the daughter. The tale grows richer the further the tellers stand from the events, which is usually the signature of literature rather than memory. Most modern historians treat the dishonoured daughter as legend, while accepting that local actors on both shores, including disaffected Visigothic factions, probably helped the crossing happen. What followed moved with astonishing speed. City after city surrendered on terms rather than face siege, and the army came up the roads toward the royal city itself. The fortress that was supposed to be nearly impossible to take, Toledo barely resisted. The sources indicate the city fell quickly, and later accounts suggest that much of its elite had already fled north. Sit with that for a moment, because it teaches the great lesson of this whole period. The strongest natural fortress in the peninsula surrendered its gates, and not because the walls failed. A fortress is only as strong as the will inside it, and the will of Visigothic Toledo had been broken in advance, not by Tariq, but by decades of its own kings murdering each other. Divided houses do not fall because the wind is strong. They fall because the beams have already cracked. We should also be honest about what the conquest was not. It was not, in these first years, a war of forced conversion. The new rulers governed Christians and Jews as protected peoples under Islamic law, taxed but permitted their faiths. Some later Arabic chronicles report that Jewish inhabitants of captured cities, after the persecutions we saw in the last chapter, cooperated with the conquerors or helped garrison captured towns. Those reports were written long after the events, and historians treat the details cautiously. But the underlying logic is grim and simple. The kingdom of Toledo had given its Jewish subjects no reason whatsoever to die for it. By around 718, the conquest of nearly the whole peninsula was complete. 2 centuries of councils and crowns, gone. The rock above the Tagus was no longer a capital. The new rulers would eventually govern from Cordoba in the south, and on the tongues of its new masters, the city's very name changed shape. Toletum became Tulaytula, but do not imagine a city erased. The churches still stood, and in most of them the mass went on. The synagogues filled again, more freely now than under the bishops, and in the workshops along the crowded streets, the smiths still hammered iron, because whoever rules a city, someone always needs blades, hinges, ploughshares, and nails. Under its new name, this city was about to spend nearly 4 centuries inside the Islamic world. Those centuries would change its streets, its skyline, its language, and its soul. Come and walk through it. Chapter 5. Tulaytula. Walk through Toledo today. Look at the oldest doorways, the horseshoe arches, the narrow lanes that bend like a river around hidden courtyards, and you are reading a message written in stone. The message says that for 374 years this was a city of the Islamic world, longer than the United States has existed, long enough to change everything. This chapter is about that city, Tulaytula, and about the 3 communities that learned, unevenly and imperfectly, to share its rock. Begin in the street. No document records a single ordinary morning in Tulaytula, but the shape of the city's life is well enough documented that we can furnish one. So picture a market day in the 11th century. In the quarter below the citadel, a water seller works the lanes with clay jars on a donkey, calling his prices in Arabic, and the voices answering him tell you the whole story of the place if you know how to listen. A Muslim cloth merchant argues cheerfully with a Christian farm wife over a bolt of linen. 2 Jewish silversmiths unshutter their stall and lay out belt buckles and bridle fittings. A scribe sets up near the gate, ready to write letters for anyone with a coin, in Arabic, for the tax office. Everyone, whatever their faith, seems to have an opinion about the price of olives. From a minaret comes the midday call to prayer. From a church tower in the Christian quarter, a little later, Abel. Nobody in the market looks up at either sound. Scenes like this are consistent with everything we know about the mixed urban life of this city, and that is the point worth holding. What sounds extraordinary from a distance of 1,000 years was, to the people in that market, simply Tuesday. Now put names to what you just saw. The rulers of this city were the Arab and Berber elite of Al-Andalus, answering to the emirs and later the caliphs of Cordoba. Around them lived a Christian population that remained. In the first generations after the conquest, probably the majority. History calls them the Mozarabs. From an Arabic word meaning Arabized, they kept their faith, their churches, and their ancient Visigothic form of the Mass, and they lived their daily lives in Arabic. A family might attend a liturgy older than most of Europe's cathedrals, then walk home discussing the sermon in the language of Baghdad. And there was the third community, the Jews of the city, freed from the convert or leave decrees of the Visigothic councils, rebuilt openly, and Tulaytula became one of the anchors of Jewish life in Spain. In the beginning of centuries, its own memory would call a golden age. Let us be precise about the deal that held this together, because both the rosy version and the grim version get sold hard, and neither is honest. Under Islamic law, Jews and Christians were dhimmi, protected peoples. The protection was real. Life, property, and worship were guaranteed at a time when religious minorities in most of Christian Europe had no such guarantee. The subordination was also real. Dimis paid a special tax and lived under rules that marked them as second class. It was not equality. It was an arrangement, and by the standards of the age it was a workable one. Coexistence in this city was never a warm feeling. It was a working agreement, renewed every day in markets like the one we just walked through. Remember that definition. The whole meaning of Toledo depends on it. The city itself, meanwhile, had lost its crown but kept its temper. Tulaytula sat on the frontier of effective control from Cordoba, and it became notorious in the Arabic chronicles as the most rebellious city in Al-Andalus, rising again and again, expelling governors, shutting its gates, daring the emirs to come up the hill. One episode became infamous. The chronicles tell of a punishment known as the Day of the Ditch, when an emir's agent invited the leading men of the city to a banquet at the fortress and had guests killed as they entered, their bodies thrown into the ditch. The Arabic sources themselves give differing dates for it, and historians doubt the enormous casualty figures in the latest tellings, while accepting that a bloody purge of the city's elite really happened. Everyone in Spain understood the meaning. This was what it cost to rule the rock. A Spanish emperor named Charles V would learn the same lesson 800 years later. Between rebellions, the city thrived, and here the story deserves more care than legend usually gives it. This was, by the 10th century, part of one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in the Western world. In Tulaytula specifically, the evidence shows serious water engineering. Irrigated gardens and orchards along the Tagus, water wheels, craftsmen working leather and metal for wide markets, and a book culture that would soon astonish Europe. The smiths were part of that world. Blades and fine metalwork from Al-Andalus were praised by Arabic writers and traded around the Mediterranean, and the decorative craft of damascening, the inlaying of gold thread into darkened steel, became a lasting signature of this city's workshops, practiced in Toledo to this day. A word of honesty here, because two similar words invite a confusion this film refuses to make. Damascening is decoration, named for Damascus as a byword for Eastern luxury. It is not the same thing as the famous Damascus steel of sword legend, which concerns the metal itself. What exactly the smiths of Tulaytula learned from the wider Islamic world about the making of blades, as opposed to the decorating of them, the sources do not let us reconstruct, and we will not invent a chain of secret recipes where the record shows us trade routes and shared markets. The honest claim is strong enough. Under Islam, this city's ancient iron craft joined one of the widest commercial and intellectual networks of the medieval world, and its reputation grew. So did its learning. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Tulaytula became a serious centre of scholarship. Astronomy above all. The astronomer Al-Zarqali, known to later Europe as Arzakal, worked here in the 11th century, refining instruments and compiling tables of the movements of the heavens so accurate that Europeans would rely on their descendants for centuries. Remember his name. In 2 chapters, Christian scholars will cross Europe on foot to read him. Then the roof fell in. In the year 1031, the Caliphate of Cordoba, exhausted by civil war, dissolved into dozens of small competing kingdoms. The Taifas. Tulaytula became capital of its own Taifa kingdom, and for a few decades its court glittered. But the Taifa world was a world of small, rich states in an age of large, hungry ones. And to the north, the Christian kingdoms that had survived 3 centuries in the mountains were growing stronger and coming down. One of them was Castile. Its king, Alfonso VI, knew this city intimately, because during a war against his own brother, He had lived here in exile, sheltered as an honoured guest by Tulaytula's Muslim king. He had walked the market we walked. He had seen the gardens, the wealth, the libraries. The most dangerous guest a city can host is one who leaves knowing exactly what it is worth. Chapter 6. 1085. Great conquests usually announce themselves with fire. Jerusalem in 1099. Constantinople in 1204. History remembers the sack, the smoke, the streets running red, which is exactly why what happened at Toledo in 1085 deserves more attention than it gets. One of the most strategically important cities of the Islamic West changed hands permanently, and almost nobody died on the day it happened. How that was possible, and what promise was made and broken within a year, is really the story of the next 4 centuries of Spain, compressed into a single city. Remember the man at the gates, Alfonso VI, King of Leon and Castile, former exile and guest of this city. While his host and protector Al-Mamun lived, Alfonso did not move against Toledo, and the chronicles even preserve a story of an oath of friendship between them. By the 1080s, Al-Mamun was dead, and his grandson Al-Qadir had inherited the Taifa and run it into the ground. Crushing taxes to pay tribute northward, factions in the streets. At moments, the city's own people drove their king out, and here the record complicates every simple tale of Christians against Muslims. Because Al-Qadir himself invited Alfonso's power into his affairs to prop up his own throne, and the final arrangement, negotiated over years, reads less like a conquest than a transaction. Al-Qadir would hand over Toledo, and Alfonso would install him as ruler of Valencia to the east. The medieval frontier ran on deals like this: kings of one faith, allying with kings of another against rivals of their own, and any telling that pretends otherwise is selling you a costume drama. A deal still needed pressure behind it, and Alfonso supplied pressure. For years his forces raided the countryside around the city, burning harvests, strangling trade, letting hunger do the work of siege engines. By the spring of 1085, the will of the city was spent, and on the 25th of May, by the traditional date, the gates opened. Alfonso VI took possession of Toledo without a storm, without a massacre, without a sack. The terms of surrender, as the sources record them, were for the 11th century astonishingly generous. Muslims who wished to stay could stay, keeping their property, their law in their own disputes, and their religion. Those who wished to leave could leave with their goods. The great mosque of the city would remain. The terms promised. A mosque. And the king, now ruling from the rock, signed himself in his documents with a swelling new style: Emperor of all Spain, while later chronicle tradition associated him with a phrase even grander: Emperor of the two religions. Whether those exact words were ever his own, the ambition they express was real and visible in his actions. Alfonso did not want to rule the ashes of Tulaytula. He wanted Tulaytula alive and working. Its farmers, its craftsmen, its scholars, its taxes, with himself at the top. Here is the one editorial point of this chapter, and it will define the golden age to come. The famous tolerance of medieval Toledo did not begin as an ideal. It began as a strategy. Alfonso needed a functioning city more than he needed a purified one, and mercy was simply the policy that preserved the value of what he had won. That does not make the mercy less real. It makes it more instructive, because it means coexistence does not have to wait for saints. It requires leaders who can see where their own interest lies, and it carries a warning this story will prove twice over. What begins as strategy can end the moment the strategy changes. It nearly ended within a year. While Alfonso was away from the city, the promise about the great mosque was broken. The building was seized and consecrated as a cathedral. The account that comes down through later chroniclers blames the king's French-born queen and the new archbishop, a French churchman named Bernard, and describes Alfonso returning in fury at the breach of his sworn word. With a famous coda in which the city's Muslims themselves beg him not to punish the perpetrators, fearing worse to come. Historians treat that dramatic scene with caution, since it appears in sources written long afterward and reads suspiciously like an attempt to launder the king's honour. The hard facts are the promise and the outcome. The mosque became the cathedral, and on its site the vast Gothic cathedral of Toledo stands today. The first great compromise of Christian Toledo lasted less than a year. Coexistence, this city teaches, is not a treaty signed once. It is a promise that has to be kept every day, and it takes exactly one powerful person deciding to stop. Yet the larger settlement held, and the city that emerged was unlike any other in Western Europe. Muslims under Christian rule, called Mudejars, remained a living community with their own quarter and their own judges. The Mozarabs were joined by Castilian settlers from the north and by French clergy and merchants, and the mixture did not blend smoothly. The Mozarabs fought to keep their ancient rite of the Mass when the newcomers tried to impose the Roman one. And a cherished local legend, recorded much later, tells of the dispute settled by ordeal. Rival prayer books cast into a fire. The old Toledan book surviving the flames. Legend, almost certainly. The fact beneath it is documented and remarkable. The old rite survived, and it is still celebrated in a chapel of Toledo Cathedral in the 21st century. A living voice from the Visigothic world, and the Jewish community now entered the greatest chapter of its long history here. Under the kings of Castile, Toledo grew into one of the most important centres of Jewish life in the peninsula, with its own walled quarter on the southwestern heights, its synagogue, its scholars, physicians, and financiers serving the crown. For the next 3 centuries, this rock held one of the great Jewish communities of the world, which brings us to the rumour that began crossing the mountains into France and beyond, whispered wherever scholars gathered. The new Christian city on the Tagus, the rumour said, held treasure beyond silver, libraries, Arabic libraries, intact, full of books the Latin world had lost 1,000 years before or had never possessed at all. Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, Galen, the mathematics of India, the medicine of Persia, the star tables of Al-Zarqali, composed on this very hill. In the cold cathedral schools of the north, men heard those names the way prospectors hear about gold. They began to walk. Chapter 7. The Translators. Every so often, history turns not on a battlefield, but on a desk. This chapter is about a desk in Toledo, and about the century and a half in which much of the lost science of the ancient world crossed it, out of Arabic, into Latin, and into the bloodstream of Europe. Few cities anywhere played a larger part in reopening that knowledge to the Latin West. That is the claim of this chapter. It is defensible, and by the end you will see why we need no bigger one. To understand why it happened here, stand in the shoes of a European scholar around 1140. You are an Englishman, say, or an Italian. You know the great names of ancient science, the way a man knows rumours, fragments, quotation, titles without books, the complete texts of Aristotle's natural philosophy, Ptolemy's astronomy. Galen's medicine survive in Greek in the Byzantine East, and in Arabic translations and commentaries across the Islamic world, which spent the 800s gathering them in Baghdad and has been studying and improving them ever since. The learning you dream of exists. It is simply locked in languages you cannot read, behind frontiers you cannot easily cross. Then you hear about Toledo, a city inside Christendom, safe to reach, that was Islamic for nearly 4 centuries and fell intact, libraries and all, a city where Arabic is still spoken in the streets by Christians and Jews 2 generations after the conquest, a city, in other words, where the books and the people who can read them live on the same rock. Sicily and southern Italy offered meeting points of the same kind, and scholars worked there too. But nowhere assembled more of the ingredients in one place than Toledo, and so it was toward Toledo that the hungriest minds of Europe walked. We know their names, because they signed their work. The most consequential of them, Gerard of Cremona, came from Italy, and a notice written by his own students after his death tells us why. He came for the love of one book, Ptolemy's Almagest, the summit of ancient astronomy, which existed nowhere in Latin. He found it in Toledo. He learned Arabic to read it, and he stayed for decades, translating, by his students' list, more than 70 works: astronomy, geometry, medicina, philosophy. One man, one city, 70 books, and European science would spend generations digesting what he alone carried across the language line. But here is what the older, tidier histories left out, and it changes the meaning of everything. Gerard and the Northerners mostly could not work alone, because classical scientific Arabic takes years to master. They worked in pairs, and their essential partners were the Arabic speakers of Toledo, above all its Jews and Mozarabs. The prefaces of the translations themselves describe the method. The Arabic reader, often a Jewish scholar, read the text aloud and rendered it into the shared Romance speech of the streets, the everyday ancestor of Spanish. The Latin scholar caught that meaning and wrote it down in Latin, sentence by sentence, hour by hour, year by year. No source records a single morning inside one of those rooms, but the method is documented in the translator's own words. So let us reconstruct the work from what they tell us, because this desk is the emotional centre of this entire film. A small chamber near the cathedral, morning light through a narrow window, dust hanging in the beam, 2 men at one table with a single manuscript between them, a Latin cleric with ink-stained fingers, and, beside him, a Toledo Jew who has read astronomy since boyhood. The older man runs his finger under a line of Arabic and speaks it slowly in the Romance of the street, hunting for a way to say a thing Latin has no word for yet. The younger man tries the phrase aloud. Once, twice, writes, scrapes the parchment, writes again. Outside there is the city, mules, church bells, a hammer somewhere, a peddler calling in Arabic. Inside there is only the quiet back and forth of 2 languages feeling for each other, 2 faiths leaning over one page. Neither man thinks he is making history. There is only the next sentence, and the sentence is stubborn, and the light is moving. Multiply that room by dozens of collaborators and 150 years. That is how a civilization gets its memory back, not in a blaze of glory, sentence by sentence, between neighbours. Put names on the chairs. In the 1100s, a scholar appearing in the Latin manuscripts as Avendorf sometimes identified by modern historians with the Jewish philosopher Abraham ibn Daud, though the identification remains disputed, worked with the Christian scholar Dominicus Gundisalinus to bring the vast philosophical encyclopedia of Avicenna, the great Persian thinker, into Latin. In the 1200s, the Jewish translator Yehuda ben Moshe worked with Christian colleagues on star tables descended from Alcázar, the astronomer of Tulaytula we met 2 chapters ago. Hold that image. A Jewish scholar and a Christian scholar in a Christian city, translating the improvements a Muslim astronomer made in that same city to the science of a Greek from Roman Egypt. If one scene could stand for what Toledo means in world history, it is that desk. Now let us clean up the legend, because the phrase "you will meet on plaques and book covers," the school of translators, promises more than the evidence shows. There was no founded institution, no building with a charter, no faculty. Modern scholarship describes something looser and frankly more interesting, overlapping circles of patrons and pairs of collaborators, cathedral clergy in the 1100s, then the crown in the 1200s, sustaining individual partnerships across decades. Not a school, a scene. The way a great city can have a music scene, drawing talent, because talent is already there, and the lesson is sharper in the honest version. Golden ages are not decreed. They happen where patronage, safety, and a critical mass of skilled people share the same streets, and they are far easier to kill than to create. The patron who understood this best was King Alfonso X of Castile, who reigned from 1252 to 1284 and earned the name El Sabio, the learned. He gathered Jewish and Christian collaborators, and for some projects Muslim ones, and he changed the game in one lasting way. Alongside Latin, he had works rendered into Castilian, the language people actually spoke, helping raise a street tongue toward a language of science and law. Under his patronage appeared the Alphonsine tables, star tables in the Toledo tradition, which spread through Europe and became standard equipment for astronomers for generations. His projects were never confined to one room or even always to one city, since the king moved and his scholars moved with him. But Toledo remained one of their principal intellectual homes. Centuries later, the astronomers of the Renaissance, Copernicus among them, still worked with tables descended from that tradition. We do not need to claim that every spark of the scientific revolution passed through this city. The traceable truth is grand enough. When Europe finally reached for the stars, some of the numbers in its hands had come down the long road from Baghdad, through Tulaytula, through this desk. So say plainly what the city of 3 cultures was, and what it was not. It was not a utopia. Jews and Muslims in Christian Toledo were protected but subordinate, useful but watched. The communities lived apart, prayed apart, mostly married apart. What they shared was work, and the peace of Toledo was a working peace. Narrow, conditional, and real. While it held, this city gave Latin Europe a larger share of its lost inheritance than almost any other place on the map. That is the honest glory of Toledo, and it needs no exaggeration. It also had an expiration date that nobody in the translation rooms could see. On the heights above the river stood one of the great Jewish communities of the diaspora. Thousands of people who had every reason to believe their city needed them. For 3 centuries they were right. Then came a century of plague and fear, and a preacher who discovered how much power there is in hatred. What burned in the summer of 1391 is where we go next. Chapter 8. the fire of 1391. Every golden age carries its ending inside it, and the people living through the ending almost never see it coming. The Jews of Toledo in the year 1300 formed one of the most established communities in Europe. They had lived on this rock for over 1,000 years, longer than Castile had existed, longer than almost any royal house on the continent. Their scholars had helped carry the ancient world into Latin. If any Jewish community on earth had reason to feel permanent, it was this one. This chapter is about how permanence died, and it is about the terrible fact that walks beside that death, because in these very same decades, in these same narrow streets, the forges of Toledo were hammering their way toward the most celebrated steel in Europe. The city was becoming a legend and destroying a people at the same time. We will hold both truths in the same hand, because that is what actually happened. Begin with the century that broke Europe's nerve. The 1300s were a catastrophe from beginning to end. Famine struck in the first decades. Then, in 1348, the Black Death arrived in Spain, part of the pandemic that killed, by modern estimates, somewhere between a third and half of Europe, and plague did something beyond killing. It demanded an explanation, and terrified people reached for the oldest explanation in Europe. Across the continent, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and were massacred. Despite the plain fact that plague killed Jews exactly as it killed Christians, Castile largely escaped that first wave of violence. But the pattern had been set, and the century was not done. Then came civil war. In the 1360s, two half-brothers fought for the crown of Castile, King Pedro and the usurper Enrique. And Enrique made a discovery that should sound uncomfortably familiar to a modern audience. Hatred wins wars. Pedro had employed Jewish financiers and officials, as Castilian kings had done for 2 centuries. So Enrique's propaganda painted his brother as the king of the Jews, and his armies treated Jewish quarters as enemy territory. When the fighting reached Toledo, the Jewish quarter paid in blood and plunder. Enrique won his crown, and every ambitious man in Castile absorbed the lesson. Attacking the Jews was no longer merely tolerated. It could be a career. One man built the fire. His name was Ferrand Martinez, Archdeacon of Asilla, a churchman in the south with a gift for the pulpit and an obsession with the Jews. Through the 1380s he preached, year after year, that the synagogues should be torn down and that the royal protections were a sin against God. The crown ordered him to stop. More than once, his own church superiors ordered him to stop. He did not stop. And here the record teaches a hard lesson about institutions. Every authority that could have removed him hesitated, and the hesitation was the permission. In 1390 the old king died. The new king was a child, and in the vacuum Martinez was, briefly, the loudest voice in Castile. The explosion came in June of 1391, in Seville, where mobs stormed the Jewish quarter. Through that summer, the violence leapt from city to city like sparks along a fuse, and the chronicles record the same pattern in each place. The mob, the choice thrust on the trapped, baptism or death, the plunder of houses and the burning of synagogues. In Toledo, the blow fell in June, and a community that had stood for 1,000 years was broken in days. No document preserves a single household from that month in Toledo, but the pattern is recorded across a dozen Spanish cities in enough detail that we can reconstruct what the day looked like from inside a house on the heights. Picture a family that has lived in the same rooms for 4 generations, in a quarter of narrow streets and courtyards above the river. The father is a physician, or a dyer, or a clerk in the service of a Castilian lord. and he has spent his whole life among Christian neighbours he greets by name. In the morning there is noise from the direction of the gate, and the noise is wrong. It is not a market crowd, and it is not a procession. Someone hammers on the door of the house across the lane. His wife takes the children into an inner room, the way her grandmother once did, because this quarter has a memory of 1360 and knows the sound, and then the choice arrives at the door, held out by men who may include faces he has known for years. A priest is there, or a basin of water, or simply a knife and a demand. Accept baptism and live. Refuse and die here, in the doorway, in front of your children, whatever that man chose, and thousands chose each way. He made the choice in the space of a breath, with no time to consult a rabbi, a lawyer, or his own conscience. That is what happened in this city in June of 1391, repeated street by street, until the quarter fell silent. We do not have reliable casualty figures for Toledo, and this film does not invent numbers where the sources are silent. What the sources do make clear is the scale of the wider catastrophe. Across the kingdoms of Spain that summer, thousands were murdered, and a great many more. On the estimates historians have assembled, accepted baptism under threat of death, in numbers running into the tens of thousands. Spanish Jewry, then the largest Jewish community in the world, was permanently transformed. The community that emerged from that summer was smaller, poorer, and frightened, and it would never again stand where it had stood in the spring. And the mass baptisms created something Spain had never faced before. A problem with a name, the converses. The converts and their descendants were now legally Christians, free of every restriction that had bound them as Jews. They could hold any office, enter any guild, marry into any family. Within 2 generations, Converso families in Toledo sat on the city council and in the cathedral chapter, and the old hatred, which had been religious, mutated into something new. If conversion no longer removed the Jew, people began to whisper. Then perhaps the problem was never belief. Perhaps it was blood. Toledo, our proud, stubborn city, now steps forward into one of the darkest scenes of its long story. In 1449, a tax dispute turned into an uprising against Converso officials, and the city government issued a decree known as the Sentencia Estatuto, barring anyone of Jewish descent from public office in the city, regardless of how sincerely Christian they were. Historians widely regard this Toledo statute as the first formal purity of blood law in Spain, the ancestor of the limpieza de sangre rules that would spread through Spanish institutions for generations. The Pope of the day condemned it. It spread anyway. Take in what was invented here. Not hatred of a religion, which was ancient, but exclusion by ancestry alone, written into law, a stain that baptism could not wash out and a grandchild could not escape. Scholars still debate how directly these statutes connect to the racial ideologies of much later centuries, and we will not overclaim. But the mechanism, discrimination by descent, codified by a city government, appears here, in Toledo, in 1449. The final axe came quickly. In 1478, the monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand obtained papal permission to establish the Spanish Inquisition, a tribunal aimed not at Jews as such, but at conversos suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. Its courts reached Toledo in 1485, and the surviving trial records show the machinery reaching deep into the city's converso elite. Modern historians working from those archives, among them Henry Kamen, have documented both the tribunal's cruelty with estimates for executions in its harshest early phase running into the thousands across Spain, and the ways later legend sometimes inflated the picture further. The honest summary is grim enough. The Inquisition was a bureaucracy of suspicion, and it taught Spaniards to fear their neighbours' memories. Then, in March of 1492, fresh from conquering Granada, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the Edict of Expulsion. Every Jew in Spain would convert or leave by the end of July. The Jews of Toledo, the remnant that had rebuilt after 1391, sold what they could, abandoned what they could not, and walked out of a city their ancestors had inhabited since Roman times. Estimates of how many left Spain altogether range widely, from around 40,000 to well over 100,000. And we let that range stand as scholarship leaves it. 2 of their synagogues still stand in Toledo today, among the oldest surviving medieval synagogue buildings anywhere in Europe, empty of the people who built them. Now the bitter counterpoint, because we promised to hold both truths. Walk back through those same 15th century streets and listen. The hammers never stopped. These are precisely the decades in which the espaderos of Toledo, the sword makers, rose toward the top of their craft, their blades increasingly sought across a Europe at war. By the end of the 1400s, the city stood on the threshold of its most celebrated century. When a Toledo blade would hang at the hip of a world empire, the city of the Translators became the city of the sword in the same generations that it drove out the people who had made the translations possible. History does not arrange itself for our comfort. Sometimes the forge and the fire burn on the same street. Chapter 9. The Sword of an Empire. At the start of the 1500s, Toledo stands at the centre of the world stage, and if this were a film, this is where the light would be brightest before the long dusk. The city held tens of thousands of people and was still growing. Wool and silk workshops employed thousands. The cathedral was nearing completion after 2.5 centuries of construction, and in 1492, the same year as the expulsion, a Genoese sailor funded by the Castilian crown had stumbled into 2 continents unknown to Europe. Silver would soon flow east across the Atlantic, and Castile, with Toledo among its greatest cities, was about to sit at the heart of one of the first empires in history that could truly be called global. That empire arrived in the person of a 19-year-old. In 1517, a young man raised in Flanders landed in Spain to claim its crowns. His name was Charles of Habsburg, and through the accidents of dynastic marriage he had inherited an almost absurd collection of titles: Castile and Aragon with their new American territories, the Netherlands and Burgundy, and in 1519 the electors of Germany chose him as Holy Roman Emperor, making him Charles V of the Empire and Charles I of Spain, ruler on parchment of more of the earth than any European since ancient Rome. Spain took one look at its new king and nearly threw him out. Understand how Charles appeared to Castilian eyes in 1520. He barely spoke Castilian. He arrived surrounded by Flemish courtiers who treated Spain as a treasure chest and collected its offices with both hands. Almost immediately he demanded enormous new taxes from the Castilian cities to pay for his imperial election. Money to be spent, as the cities saw it, on German politics that meant nothing to Spain. Then he sailed away to be crowned, leaving a foreign regent in charge, to the proud cities of Castile, with their ancient charters and assemblies. It looked like the crown had been captured by outsiders and the country reduced to a purse. Toledo said no first. By now, that should not surprise you. In the spring of 1520, the city expelled the royal officials and declared itself in rebellion, and city after city followed. Segovia, Salamanca, Valladolid, until much of the heart of Castile was governed by a league of rebel communes. History calls it the Revolt of the Comuneros, and its leading figure, a Toledo nobleman named Juan de Padilla, became the face of the cause. The rebels' demands, preserved in their petitions, sound startlingly ahead of their time. The king must live in Castile. Offices must go to Castilians. Taxes require consent. The assembly of cities should meet regularly whether the king summons it or not. Some historians read the Comuneros as an early constitutional movement, a claim that even an emperor is bound by law. Others stress its local and traditional motives. We give you both readings. What no one disputes is the nerve of the thing. City councils and cloth merchants were defying the most powerful ruler in Europe. The rebellion lasted a year and died in an afternoon. In April of 1521, at the village of Villalar, the royal army caught the Comunero forces in rain and mud and broke them. Padilla was captured and beheaded the next day alongside two fellow commanders. And here the story hands the stage to one of the most remarkable women in Spanish history. When the news from Villalar reached Toledo, the rebellion had lost its army, its leaders, and its cause. Every other city was negotiating its surrender. What happened next in Toledo is documented, and it is extraordinary. Padilla's widow, Maria Pacheco, took command, not as a symbol, as the actual authority in a walled city under threat of royal siege. Consider what that meant in the spring of 1521, and consider it slowly. She had to find money for a city whose trade had collapsed. She had to keep armed men fed and paid when the cause they had joined was already lost. And when every week brought word of another town accepting the emperor's terms, she had to negotiate with royal commanders who regarded her husband as a traitor and her position as an outrage against nature. And she had to hold together a population that adored her but was watching the ground close in. She managed it for 9 months after the war was over everywhere else. Only in February of 1522 did resistance in Toledo finally end, and Maria escaped in disguise to Portugal, where she lived out her life in exile and was never pardoned. Toledo was the first city to rise and the last to fall. Write that beside Livy's old phrase, because between them they tell you everything about this place. Small, but fortified by its location. First to rise, last to fall. Charles, to his credit, learned what emirs had learned before him about punishing this city, and he chose a lighter hand than victory allowed. In the decades that followed, he made Spain the true centre of his world, learned its language, and kept his court frequently at Toledo, whose population climbed, by most estimates, towards 60,000, making it one of the great cities of the peninsula. He rebuilt the Alcázar, the fortress on the city's highest point, as a Renaissance palace whose 4 square silhouette still crowns Toledo today. These decades, roughly the 1520s to the 1550s, are the city's golden noon. Silk and steel poured from its workshops. The greatest churchmen, artists, and writers of Spain moved through its streets. And the sword. This is the century our story has been forging towards since the opening. So let us give the steel its due, and let us do it honestly, because the record and the legend are 2 different kinds of treasure. The record first. By the 1500s, the espaderos of Toledo worked under a system of documented rigour, surviving guild ordinances, and the royal regulations that followed them. Describe apprenticeships, examination, and registered maker's marks, each master stamping his blades with a personal mark recorded so that a flawed blade could be traced back to the man who made it. They also describe tests a blade had to survive before it could be sold. Trials designed to reject any sword that would break under stress or fail to spring back to true. Accountability, enforced in steel. That, more than any secret, is the rational core of the Toledo legend. Quality control, generations deep, with a man's name behind every edge. Now the legend, and it is worth telling precisely because everyone in Europe told it. Later stories claimed the masters timed their tempering by murmured prayers. Judging the steel by its colour as the words ran out, they claimed the waters of the Tagus, even the fine sand of its banks, held the secret of the quench, and that a blade tempered anywhere else would never be the same. How much truth hides inside those stories? Metallurgists and historians still argue. What the stories certainly prove is the size of the reputation, because nobody invents magic to explain an ordinary product. The demanding customers of the age agreed. Toledo blades were carried by Spanish soldiers across Europe and the Americas, praised in the fencing treatises of the period, ordered by kings, and counterfeited by forgers who faked Toledo marks, which may be the sincerest tribute a brand has ever received. English writing of the age used the city's name as shorthand for a superb weapon, so that an audience in London could hear the word Toledo and picture a perfect blade without further explanation. 4 centuries before Hollywood, the brand was already famous on a stage. So picture the city at its noon, around 1555, the emperor's palace rising on the height, the cathedral glowing with silver from a new world, tens of thousands in the streets, and the ring of hammers threading through the church bells. Toledo had been a hill fort, a Roman town, a royal city, a revoltifer, the city of the Translators, and now stood among the first cities of a world empire. It had every reason to believe the next century belonged to it too. It did not. Within a single decade, one quiet decision by one reserved young king would take the future away, not with a siege, but with a signature. Chapter 10. The year everything left. Cities die in different ways. Some burn, some are murdered, and this story has stood in the ashes of a few. But there is a quieter way for a city to lose its future, and Toledo is one of history's clearest examples of it. Nobody attacked Toledo in the 1560s. One spring, the king simply moved his court 40 miles north, to a modest town called Madrid. That was all. No decree of punishment, no explanation that survives. And with that one administrative decision, the golden noon ended and the long evening began. An evening that, in a twist nobody could have foreseen, is one major reason so much of the old city still stands today. The king was Philip II, son of the Emperor Charles, and he was everything his father was not. Charles had governed a scattered world from horseback. Philip governed it from a desk. He ruled his global inheritance with paper, reading dispatches from Mexico and Milan and Manila, annotating the margins in his small, careful hand. Decade after decade, he wanted a fixed capital for the machinery of files and councils. And for a few years, Toledo, his father's favoured city, must have seemed a candidate. The court resided there. His wedding was celebrated there. Then, in the spring of 1561, the order went out. The court would move to Madrid, and here an honest historian must make an admission that is almost comical given the scale of the consequences. We do not know exactly why. Philip left no explanation, and the theories argued ever since each carry some weight. Madrid sat near the exact centre of the peninsula, a blank page where a capital could grow without fighting an ancient city's tangled streets and entrenched interests. Toledo's site, magnificent for defence, was a nightmare for expansion, a rock in a gorge with nowhere flat to build, and water that had to be hauled up from the river. And in Toledo a king would forever share his capital with the Archbishop Primate of Spain, while Madrid would have one master, whatever the mixture of motives. Notice what the decision reveals. The very features that had made Toledo unconquerable for 2,000 years now disqualified it from the future. The fortress logic that founded the city finally presented its bill. The effects came fast, because a royal court was the largest concentration of spending in Spain. Thousands of nobles, officials, servant, and everyone who fed, clothed, and housed them. When the court left, the money left. The figures historians have assembled from censuses and parish records tell the story with brutal simplicity. Toledo, around 1560, held, by most estimates, some 60,000 people. A century later, perhaps a third of that number remained. The silk workshops withered as fashion and finance followed the court. Rents collapsed. Spain as a whole was sliding into its long 17th century crisis of plague, war, and inflation, and Toledo, stripped of its engine, fell faster and further than almost any city in Castile. And yet, precisely at this lowest turning, the city received its portraitist, one of the strangest and greatest painters who ever lived. In 1577, a Greek painter from Crete arrived in Toledo, trained in the Byzantine icon tradition, seasoned in Venice, lately disappointed in Rome and at the royal court, where his work had failed to please the king. His name was Dominikos Theotokopoulos, and the Spanish, unable to manage that, simply called him the Greek, El Greco. He came, most likely, hoping for commissions on his way to somewhere better. He stayed 37 years, until his death in 1614, and Toledo became the whole world of his art. The clergy and scholars of the shrinking city gave him work, altarpieces, portraits of priests and gentlemen with pale faces and dark, intelligent eyes, and for a parish church, a vast canvas of the burial of a local nobleman that many now count among the great paintings of Europe. And late in life he painted the city itself, the view over the gorge under a torn green sky, the buildings elongated and trembling as if the rock were dreaming. That is the canvas we began this film in front of, hanging today in New York, 4,000 miles from the hill it shows. Art historians still argue over the style, some seeing his Byzantine inheritance, some mystic fervour, some simply a fiercely personal manner centuries ahead of its taste. What matters for our story is the marriage. A city that had just lost its earthly importance met a painter with no interest in earthly importance, and together they produced an image of Toledo as a city of the spirit, austere, vertical, storm-lit, which has shaped how the world sees it ever since. If you have ever looked at a photograph of Toledo at dusk and felt something almost supernatural in that skyline, you are seeing through El Greco's eyes. Here is the paradox of this chapter, and it is worth carrying out of this story into your own century. Toledo's failure helped save it. Look at the cities that stayed rich: London, Paris, Madrid itself. Prosperity is a demolition crew, tearing down each generation's city to build the next, leaving the past in fragments between the towers. Toledo, after 1561, had little money for grand rebuilding, and so, to a degree rare in Europe. It kept what it had. The mosque turned churches, the synagogues, the Mudejar brickwork, the tangled street plan inherited from Tulaytula. The picture needs its honest shading, because the city did keep building, adapting and demolishing at its slower pace, as living cities always do. But the great engine of erasure, boom town money, had moved to Madrid, and Toledo drifted into the following centuries, carrying an almost complete medieval city on its back. Decline, a tragedy for those who lived through it, became an accidental gift to everyone who came after. So picture Toledo as the 1600s close. Grass in the courtyards of palaces, the Alcázar half empty on its height, a shrunken population holding on in the shell of a former capital, and down by the river, fewer than before but never silent, the hammers, what the long quiet centuries did to the city, and how a king's factory saved the sword itself from extinction, is where we go next. Chapter 11. The Long Sleep. Between the 1600s and the 1900s, history seems to happen everywhere except Toledo. Empire rise and fall, revolutions redraw the maps, and our city sits on its rock like a grandfather, asleep by the fire while the household argues around him. But sleep is not death. Two threads remain visible through the quiet, and this chapter follows them. One is steel. The other is the city's image in the world's imagination. Follow both, and they lead directly to the Toledo you can visit today. Start with the steel, because in the 1700s the famous blade very nearly died. The decline was not mysterious. It was arithmetic. The gunpowder age kept advancing, and the sword kept retreating, from the weapon that won battles to a sidearm, a cavalry tool, an officer's badge of rank. The guild world of the escuderos depended on a deep market of customers, and the market thinned with every decade. Masters died without apprentices. Workshops closed one by one. By the early 1700s, accounts of the trade describe a craft shrunken to a shadow of its golden age. What saved it was the state, in the person of a reforming king, Carlos III, who reigned from 1759 to 1788, belonged to the enlightened monarchs of his century, rulers who built academies, roads, and factories in the belief that a crown should engineer prosperity. In 1761, his government founded the Real Fábrica de Armas, the Royal Arms Factory of Toledo, precisely to rescue the dying craft. The crown recruited the skilled makers who remained and converted much of the old workshop trade into a standardized state industry. And in time the factory settled into a grand, purpose-built complex on the flat ground by the Tagus. We have the factory's buildings and its regulations rather than a diary of its floor. So let us reconstruct a winter morning there around 1800 from what those records describe. Light comes through high windows into a long hall that smells of coal smoke, oil, and scorched water. At the forges, strikers swing in steady rhythm while the masters turn the glowing bars, reading the colour of the metal much as their grandfathers did, except that now an inspector with a ledger walks the rows, and every blade that passes its tests is stamped and entered in the books. An old man who learned his trade in a family workshop may well have grumbled that this was not how his father did it. A boy of 14, apprenticed to the state instead of to an uncle, learned the trade anyway. Something was lost in that hall, the world of the independent master, answerable for his own name, and something was saved that would otherwise have vanished, because the hammers kept ringing by the Tagus after they had gone quiet almost everywhere else. The reputation had passed through fire again, from guild to factory, and survived the passage. Brands, it turns out, can outlive not only empires, but the very way of life that created them. The city around the factory endured the storms of the age, mostly as a victim. When Napoleon's armies occupied Spain after 1808, Toledo was occupied too, and the war that followed treated it roughly. Garrisons, requisition, and in the aftermath the confiscations and closures that emptied many of the convents which had anchored the city for centuries. The population barely moved for 100 years. Toledo entered the 1800s, a provincial town of some 20,000, and left it much the same. A cathedral city living on church, garrison, and memory, while Madrid, 40 miles north, swelled into a true capital. And then the world came looking for the ghost. The same romantic century that industrialized Europe fell in love with everything industry was destroying, and its writers and painters began to travel in search of the old, the ruined, the picturesque. Spain, poor and proud and largely untouched by the factory age, became their treasure house. Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra taught a generation of English readers to dream of Spain, of Granada above all. And in the wake of that dream the travellers spread across the peninsula and found Toledo waiting like a stage set that had never been struck. By the later 1800s, the city fills the travel books as a place where time had stopped. Silent streets, locked churches, Moorish arches, described with the melancholy thrill the age reserved for beautiful ruins. The Spanish novelist Benito Pérez Galdós called Toledo a history of Spain written in stone. Tourism in the modern sense was being invented, and Toledo became one of its Spanish shrines. Slowly, the city discovered that its sleep was a treasure. The catastrophe of 1561 was becoming, 3 centuries late, the foundation of a new economy, selling not silk or swords but the past itself. The craftsmen adapted with their usual cunning. If travellers wanted the romance of Toledo steel, Toledo would give them steel they could carry home. The factory and a constellation of small workshops leaned into the old decorative art of damascening. Gold and silver thread hammered into blackened metal and turned it toward plates, boxes, jewellery, and miniature swords. By the century's end, damascene work was the city's signature souvenir, as it remains today. Call that a come-down if you like. A warrior craft dwindled to trinkets. Look closer, and you see the same instinct this city has practiced since the Romans, keeping a skill alive in whatever vessel the age will pay for, waiting for history to turn again. The 20th century opened on a Toledo apparently retired from great events, a small city of priests, craftsmen, and cadets. Hold on to the cadets. Since the 1840s, the Alcázar, the great four-towered palace on the summit, had housed the Spanish Army's infantry academy, generations of young officers training on the height above the gorge. For 80 years it was the sleepiest institution in a sleepy city. Then, for 70 days in one terrible summer, it was the most watched building on earth. Chapter 12. The Siege of the Alcázar. We arrive now at the hardest chapter in this story, and we should say plainly why it is hard. Everything else in this film happened long ago, and time has cooled it. What happened in Toledo in the summer of 1936 happened less than a century ago, inside the family memory of people alive today, in a war Spaniards still argue about, and the events at the Alcázar were turned into propaganda before they were even over. So this chapter carries a double duty: to tell you what happened on the rock, and to show you how the telling itself became a second battlefield. We will name our sources. We will mark the legends. And we will not flatten a story this contested into heroes and villains. First, the war. In July of 1936, a group of army generals rose against the elected government of the Spanish Republic. The rising succeeded in some cities and failed in others, and Spain split violently in two. On one side, the rebel nationalists, backed by much of the officer corps, the hardened army of Africa, the church hierarchy, and before long the fascist powers of Italy and Germany. On the other, the Republicans, holding the government, most of the navy, and a coalition running from liberals to socialists, communists, and anarchists, aided in time by the Soviet Union. The civil war that followed lasted 3 years, killed hundreds of thousands, and served as a rehearsal stage for the World War that came after. Historians such as Hugh Thomas, Paul Preston, and Anthony Beevor have chronicled it exhaustively, and their work stands behind this chapter. In Toledo, the rising put the city in Republican hands, but not the fortress. The military governor of the province, an infantry colonel named José Moscado, declared for the rebellion and shut himself inside the Alcázar with a garrison drawn mostly from the Guardia Civil, the paramilitary police, along with army officers, cadets, and right-wing volunteers, and with hundreds of civilians, including the women and children of the defenders' families. The best documented accounts put the total inside at around 1,800 people. And here we must record an uncomfortable fact attested by the major historians. The defenders also held hostages, including the provincial governor and relatives of known leftists. And the fate of those hostages remains one of the siege's unresolved darknesses, because most were never seen again. The siege lasted about 70 days. From late July to late September, Republican militias held the city and pounded the fortress with artillery, aircraft, and finally 2 enormous mines dug under the towers and packed with explosives. The Alcázar was hammered into a mountain of rubble. Photographs from the siege's end, preserved in the archives and reproduced in every history of the war, show the building reduced to something like a bitten sandcastle, towers gone, facades collapsed. Yet in the cellars beneath the rubble, on rationed horse meat and dwindling water, the garrison and the families held on, week after week, while correspondents from a dozen countries watched from the city below and made the siege the most famous story of the war's first summer. Now the legend, and we will handle it exactly as we handled Count Julian's daughter. The story first, the source criticism immediately after. The famous episode dates to the 23rd of July, the 3rd day of the siege. According to the nationalist account, repeated afterward in countless books and films, the militia leadership telephoned Colonel Moscado inside the fortress. They had captured his 16-year-old son, Luis, and they put the boy on the line. "Surrender the Alcázar," the message ran, "or your son dies." The colonel, in this account, told his son to commend his soul to God, to shout, "Long live Spain," and to die like a patriot. The Alcázar, he told the militia leader, would never surrender. What does the record support? That Luis Moscado was in Republican hands is not disputed, and that he was killed is not disputed. By the weight of the evidence, he died about a month later, in late August, shot in a reprisal, killing alongside other prisoners after an air raid, part of a murderous pattern that both zones of Spain saw that summer. When military setbacks and bombings were answered with the killing of prisoners, what historians have questioned is the telephone scene itself. The researcher Herbert Southworth, in a famous critical study, and later scholars of the siege's mythology pointed out that the story rests almost entirely on nationalist commemorative sources, that its details shifted between tellings, and that the dramatic execution directly linked to the call did not happen as told, since the boy died weeks later in different circumstances. Other historians reply that some form of threatening call very likely occurred, and that a father's defiance under such a threat needs no embroidery. We give you both positions, and the honest summary is this: a boy was murdered, a father was bereaved, and a regime then polished that grief into a recruiting poster. The tragedy is fact. The scene, as cinema knows it, is monument rather than transcript. Why does the mythology matter so much? Because of what happened next. In late September of 1936, the nationalist commander, Francisco Franco, had his armies advancing on Madrid, whose fall might have ended the war within months. Instead, he turned his columns aside to relieve Toledo. On the 27th and 28th of September, his troops took the city and reached the ruins of the Alcázar, militarily. Most historians judge the detour a costly gift to the Republic, buying Madrid the weeks it needed to organize a defense that then held for over 2 years. Politically, it was a masterstroke for one man. Franco entered the world's newspapers as the savior of the heroes of the Alcázar, and within days he was proclaimed head of state of nationalist Spain. The siege had given the rising its founding miracle, and Franco made sure he owned it. For 4 decades of dictatorship, the Alcázar was rebuilt stone by stone. The story was taught to school children, and Moscado's shattered office was preserved as a shrine. The bullet scars and the old telephone displayed like relics, and the relief of the city had its own darkness. Recorded by correspondents at the time and confirmed by later historians, the conquest of Toledo was followed by killings of prisoners and suspected Republicans, including accounts of wounded militiamen killed where they lay. The city that had watched terror under one flag now watched it under another. This film has shown you Toledo as the stage of Spain's noblest hours. Honesty compels us to show it as the stage of this too. After the war, Toledo settled into the long grey decades of the dictatorship, a provincial capital again, its Alcázar rebuilt as a symbol, its tourism slowly growing, its factory still working by the river. Franco died in November of 1975, and then Spain surprised the world. Within a handful of years, Spaniards built a parliamentary democracy and voted themselves a constitution in 1978. The transition was not the clean reconciliation of legend. It was built on hard bargains and on silences about the past that Spaniards still argue over today. And it unfolded amid real political violence. But it held. The country that had torn itself apart within living memory chose, imperfectly and argumentatively, to live together under law. A city of 3 cultures could have told them something about how that is done, and about how easily it is undone. Chapter 13. The City That Remembers Everything. Every story this long owes its audience a final answer. Not what happened, but what remains. So this last chapter walks through the Toledo of today and checks on everything we have followed for 2,000 years. The rock, the 3 cultures, the painter, and the steel, all 4 threads are still alive, and the way each survived tells you what kind of city this finally is. Begin with the frame modern Spain built around it. Under the Constitution of 1978, Spain organized itself into autonomous regions, and Toledo received a fitting consolation for its lost crown. It became the capital of Castilla-La Mancha, the vast region of the Central Plateau, the land of Don Quixote's windmills. Government returned to the rock. in its modest regional form, after 4 centuries away. Then, in 1986, came the recognition that reframed everything. UNESCO inscribed the historic city of Toledo on the World Heritage List, citing more than 2,000 years of history and the works left by the successive civilizations, Roman, Visigothic, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian, that had shared this one small stretch of stone. The failure of 1561 had completed its long transformation into treasure. The consequences remade daily life. Toledo today is among the most visited historic cities in Spain, drawing very large numbers of visitors each year, the great majority of them day trippers. Since 2005, riding a high-speed train that covers in about half an hour the distance to Madrid that sealed the city's fate in 1561. They walk the Alcázar, which now houses the Spanish Army Museum. They fill the cathedral, where El Greco's canvases hang a few steps from the chapel in which the ancient Visigothic rite is still celebrated. A liturgy with roots older than almost any still in regular use in Western Europe, and they crowd into the 2 surviving medieval synagogues and the museum of Sephardic culture that Spain maintains in one of them, because the third culture, absent for 5 centuries, has returned to the city's memory in a way worth examining honestly. Spain's reckoning with 1492 accelerated in the democratic decades. In 1992, 500 years after the Edict of Expulsion, the King of Spain stood in a synagogue beside the President of Israel in a gesture of reconciliation. In 2015, Spain passed a law offering citizenship to descendants of the expelled Sephardic Jews, and tens of thousands applied before the window closed, though the law's conditions, paperwork, and uneven outcomes drew criticism alongside the praise, and no one should mistake it for a debt fully paid. In Toledo itself, the old Jewish quarter has been mapped, signposted, and studied, its lost synagogues traced, its memory turned into education. Be honest about the limits. A memorial culture is not a community, and Jewish Toledo today is measured in monuments and museums rather than living congregations. But remember where this film stood in Chapter 8. In streets where dissent itself was made a crime. A country that once wrote purity of blood into law now writes citizenship for the descendants of the expelled. History does not offer refunds. It occasionally offers apologies. They are not nothing. And the steel. Here the story closes its longest circle. The Royal Arms Factory by the Tagus, founded in 1761, closed as a military plant in the late 20th century, and its grand neoclassical halls were reborn as a campus of the University of Castilla-La Mancha. Students read today where the swords were forged. Walk those grounds, and you are walking inside the best single image this story owns. The factory of blades turned into a house of books, the sword and the book under one roof at last. But the craft did not die, because it found one more market, and it is the market that brought many of you to this video. The screen. Toledo's workshops have long supplied and marketed blades for theatrical, ceremonial, and screen-related use. And when the film industry came to Spain in the middle of the 20th century to shoot its historical epics, the city's reputation put it exactly where such work is sourced. In our own century, as fantasy cinema boomed, Toledo factories poured out officially licensed replicas of famous movie swords for collectors around the world. Work you should not confuse with the original props used in filming. Alongside them survive the last artisan forges, family workshops where masters still shape and temper blades by hand for collectors, fencers, and stage and screen productions. A word of buyer's honesty the local masters will tell you themselves. Much of what glitters in the souvenir shops is imported and merely finished locally. The real thing exists, and it is rarer and dearer, as real things are. Somewhere in Toledo this week, a smith heated steel, watched its colour change, and quenched it, working in a tradition that this city traces, through many interruptions and reinventions, back to the metal-working cultures of ancient Iberia. Not an unbroken chain. Nothing human is unbroken across 2,000 years. Call it something truer, a reputation that outlived every empire that carried it, and a city that never once let the fire go completely out. One more resident deserves his bow. El Greco, dismissed after his death as a talented eccentric, was rediscovered by the modern eye. The painters of the early 20th century, Cézanne, Picasso, the Expressionists, saw in his flame-like figures a prophet of their own revolutions, and by the 400th anniversary of his death, in 2014, the city he painted was filled with exhibitions and pilgrims in his honour, his Toledo, austere and storm lit above the gorge, is now protected by law, floodlit at night, recognisably the same silhouette he set down 4 centuries ago. Very few cities on earth can stand beside their own portrait from 400 years ago and still resemble it. So take the measure of the city in 2026. As we took its measure at the golden noon of 1555, around 88,000 people live in the municipality now, most of them in modern neighbourhoods spread on the flat land beyond the gorge, while the old city on the rock, with its few thousand residents, its students, its craftsmen, its priests, and its rivers of visitors, does the work of remembering for all of Spain. It is a small city again, as it was when Livy first wrote it down. Small, but fortified by its location. Only the meaning of the fortification has changed. The walls that once kept armies out now guard an unusually complete stone record of the civilizations that made this country, kept by the one city too stubborn to throw its past away, which leaves only the question we opened with. Standing in a gallery in New York in front of a painting of a storm, the sword or the book, which one is the real Toledo? It is time to answer. Go back to the beginning. A canvas on a wall 4,000 miles from Spain, a hill under a torn sky. And a question. How can the same small city be famous for weapons and for wisdom, for the finest steel of its age, and for its most patient scholarship? We have walked 22 centuries looking for the answer. Here it is. The sword and the book were never opposites. They are the same achievement, practiced 2 different ways. Think about what a great blade actually is. Before a sword becomes violence, it is metallurgy, judgment, apprenticeship, quality control, 1,000 small refinements passed from hand to hand, a craft held to a standard so consistent for so long that a city's name became a promise stamped in steel. What Toledo learned to do with iron was to take hard, stubborn, unpromising material and, with heat and pressure and generations of accumulated skill, give it an edge that would not shatter. Now think about what happened at the translators' desks. Scholars of 3 faiths took the hardest, most stubborn material there is, human difference, languages without a common alphabet, communities that prayed apart and buried their dead apart, and they worked it, sentence by sentence, book by book, under the heat of curiosity and the pressure of patronage, until it yielded something few places in Latin Europe could produce at the same scale. Not because the people of Toledo were better than other people, The fires of 1391. The Statute of 1449. The hostages of 1936 prove forever that they were not, but for a few generations, this city built the working conditions in which difference became strength instead of fuel. That is the craft. Coexistence is not a feeling, it is a skill. Like tempering steel, it is learned slowly, lost quickly, and always one careless generation from extinction. Both lessons were forged on the same rock. A working peace needs leaders who see their interest in it, institutions that keep their promises, and work worth doing together. And such a peace dies. When it dies, not usually by invasion, but through ambitious men who discover how much power there is in hatred, and through every authority that could stop them hesitating until hesitation becomes permission. Toledo is not a fairy tale about tolerance. It is a record of what coexistence actually required, and of how it was lost. Tonight, when the floodlights come on above the gorge, the skyline El Greco painted will stand against the dark. The cathedral of the Translators' patrons, the rebuilt Alcázar with its scars, the quarter where Sepharad sang, and down by the river, in the old factory of swords, a light in a library window, a student reading late where the forges burned, holding in her hands, whether she knows it or not, a book that exists because strangers once trusted each other in this city. The blade and the book. Toledo made both, lost both, and kept the memory of both. What it asks of us is simple to say and hard to do. Keep the edge. Keep the promise. They are forged the same way. Thank you for spending this journey with us. The story of Spain is far from finished, and the road from Toledo runs south, toward a city with a forest of striped arches and a story that will change how you see the Middle Ages. Cordoba is waiting. We will see you there.